Bible begins at age 30, but Jesus lived 3 decades before that, unchronicled, unexplained. Those years weren't lost. They were hidden. In temples, deserts, and silence, he was being prepared. Not to be worshipped, but to carry a frequency. He wasn't born awakened. He trained to remember, to become the mirror of what we all are. The Essenes guided him. So did mystics, seers, and unseen beings beyond time. This is the part you were never taught, the sacred preparation behind the story. And once you hear it, you may remember, his path wasn't a legend, it was a pattern, one that still lives in you. Long before his birth, they were waiting. The Essenes did not stumble into Jesus' life. They prepared for it centuries in advance. Their texts, rituals, and daily lives revolved around a singular knowing that a great soul would arrive, one who would bring a shift in human consciousness. This wasn't blind faith. It was coordination. The Essenes were not just a religious sect. They were keepers of frequency. They studied light, sound, energy, and timing. Their practices were designed to maintain spiritual purity, not for moral superiority, but to ensure vibrational readiness. They believed a being would incarnate who could hold and transmit what they called the Christ current, a direct alignment with Source. Some saw this prophecy as metaphor. The Essenes did not. They knew the timelines. Through dream work, star alignments, and inner vision, they tracked subtle shifts in the collective field. When patterns repeated, cycles echoing through time, they listened. And what they saw was unmistakable. A convergence point was approaching, and a soul of uncommon clarity would enter the earth plane. But this arrival wasn't guaranteed. Certain conditions had to be met. The environment had to be purified. Lineages had to be cleared. Certain souls, those who would become his teachers, protectors, and companions, had to incarnate in synchrony. Each was trained not only in outer knowledge, but in inner stillness, so they could recognize him when the time came. He would not announce himself. He would be born like anyone else, in a fragile body, through pain and breath and blood. And he would forget just like every soul forgets when it enters this world. But the plan was in place. The Essenes believed that if the path around him was kept clean, the memory within him would return. Their work began generations before the child was born. Entire lifetimes were spent preparing families, constructing sacred locations, preserving ancient texts, and forming communities removed from the chaos of the world. These weren't acts of isolation. They were acts of alignment. They didn't want to protect him from the world. They wanted to protect his frequency, because when the soul arrived, it would not be immune to interference. The earth is dense. Its gravity isn't just physical, it's energetic. And for a soul to remain clear, to hold divine memory while growing through human experience, everything around it must support the remembering. In the higher realms, the soul that would become Jesus was already preparing. He had lived before, in other forms, under other names. But this mission was different. It would not be a personal journey. It would be an offering, a transmission. His life was to become a living symbol, reflecting what lies dormant in all human beings. The Essenes understood this. To them, his presence would not be a miracle, but the result of deliberate alignment between dimensions. They believed that when earth and heaven vibrated in harmony, a gateway could open, a bridge allowing higher consciousness to incarnate directly into form. They were not waiting for a savior. They were preparing a landing site for a frequency. This is why their practices were so disciplined. They worked in silence, fasted regularly, maintained celibacy, purified their thoughts, not from fear, but from devotion. They knew that even one impure thought could ripple through the energy field and interfere with the unfolding plan. It wasn't about control. It was about resonance. Within their sacred circles, they received guidance through trance, through dreams, through the whisper of the inner voice. And again, they were told the same message. He is coming. Hold the field. Many of them would never live to see him. But they prepared anyway, because they understood that spiritual work transcends lifetimes. Their children, or their children's children, might be the ones to stand beside him. And so the teachings were passed on quietly, carefully, like embers kept alive in the dark. Elsewhere in the world, others received similar messages. In the mountains of India, seers spoke of a radiant one who would bring balance to the earth. In Egypt, remnants of the ancient priesthood whispered of a soul that would restore the inner sun. Even among certain star lineages, there was awareness that something rare was unfolding. The convergence was not just planetary, it was cosmic. And then he entered, not as fire, not as thunder, but as breath, a cry in the night. A child, fragile and small, unaware of who he truly was. But around him, the field was ready. The path had been cleared, the codes preserved, the guardians in place. What had been seen in visions now began to take shape in time. The Christ was not yet awake, but he was here, and everything was about to change. Before the child could arrive, the mother had to be prepared. Mary was not chosen at random. Her selection was the result of generations of planning, spiritual cultivation, and inner readiness. The Essenes did not merely look for a woman, they looked for a frequency match, one who could hold the vibration of the soul that would become Jesus without distortion. From birth, Mary was raised within sacred boundaries. She was protected from chaotic energy, worldly distractions, and emotional entanglements that could compromise her spiritual clarity. Her life was quiet, structured, deeply internal. The elders around her knew she carried a unique imprint. Her energy field was unusually still, sensitive, receptive. But purity wasn't enough. She needed to be conscious. Mary's training began in childhood not through doctrine, but through direct experience. She was taught how to sense subtle energies, how to calm her mind, how to feel truth within silence. Her body was nourished with clean foods. Her mind was given only what aligned. She was taught to breathe with intention, to sleep aligned with lunar cycles, to listen to the earth. More importantly, she was taught how to carry presence. To the Essenes, this was the highest preparation, the ability to stay completely open without being overwhelmed, to feel vast energies move through you and remain unmoved. Because when the moment came, when the conception occurred, it wouldn't be biological in the traditional sense. It would be energetic. Conception was not seen as an act of flesh. It was a convergence of fields. According to Essene knowledge, Mary's womb had to become a living temple. Every organ, every cell, every emotion had to be aligned with divine rhythm. She wasn't just going to carry a child. She was going to carry a soul still vibrating at the edge of pure source. To do this, she needed help, and she received it. Throughout her youth, Mary was surrounded by women who carried deep memory, priestesses, healers, midwives of spirit. Many had no titles. Some never spoke publicly. But they held a lineage that stretched back through Atlantis, Lemuria, and even before. Their purpose was singular. Prepare the one who would prepare the one. These women didn't teach through words. They transmitted through resonance. Mary would sit with them in silence, absorbing more than she could explain. At times, she would feel her body shift without movement. Visions would arrive uninvited. Sometimes she felt as though she were being prepared, not just for a child, but for a memory that hadn't yet entered time. And then the dreams began. Not ordinary dreams, but luminous sequences, symbols, light forms, impressions of distant places she had never visited. In one, she was shown a spiral of light descending into water. In another, she stood in a chamber beneath the earth, surrounded by a circle of radiant figures. No one told her what they meant. They didn't have to. Her soul remembered. Around her, others began to sense it too. Some of the elders whispered that she would be the one. Others weren't certain, but all agreed her vibration was unlike any they had seen. She was quiet, but not timid. Gentle, but unshakable. There was a stillness in her that made even the air feel calm. Then came the convergence. One night, under specific celestial alignments, a ritual was held, not for show, but for synchronization. Mary was not told what would happen. She was simply asked to enter a prepared space, to sit in stillness, and to remain open. The women encircled her, not chanting, not invoking, but holding a single unified frequency. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Something entered, not as sound, not as vision, but as knowing. A presence so vast and soft it could barely be perceived moved through her field and into her womb. It brought no pain, no fear, only a clarity so pure it burned through every layer of doubt. And in that moment, she understood, not intellectually, but viscerally, that something eternal had begun. There was no thunder, no announcement, just breath, and then silence. Afterward, she asked no questions, because there was nothing to explain. Her training was complete. The soul was on its way, and within her, the light began to grow. After the birth, the silence continued. There was no fanfare, no signs in the sky. The world turned as it always had. But in the quiet margins, something new had entered, a soul of rare clarity, wrapped in the body of an infant. And while stories would later form around the event, the truth was far simpler. He was born into the world like anyone else, small, vulnerable, forgetting. The earliest threat came quickly. A ruler's fear turned into violence, and the family was forced to flee. But this too had been foreseen. The journey into Egypt was not an escape, it was a return. The land they entered was not foreign to the soul now called Jesus. In fact, its sands carried echoes he had known before. Buried beneath stone and time, Egypt held teachings that predated all scriptures. And even in decline, the remnants of that knowledge still pulsed quietly in hidden chambers and sacred enclaves. Jesus spent his formative years in this environment, not as a student yet, but as one being imprinted. He walked through temples whose geometry still whispered. He touched glyphs carved by hands long turned to dust. And though his young mind could not translate these things, his energy field did. Information moved beyond thought, directly into resonance. His parents didn't treat him as special. They treated him as sacred. There's a difference. They didn't fill his head with expectations. They gave him space, time, quiet. And in that openness, he began to notice things, subtle things. He would speak of lights around people, of voices without sound, of shapes that moved when no one else saw. And slowly, his inner perception began to open. The Essenes had contacts in Egypt, though not openly connected to the priesthoods. They were known among smaller, purer lineages that had preserved certain Atlantean currents. These were not schools with scrolls and rules. These were people of silence, keepers of vibration. They recognized the child immediately, not by his face, but by his field. One woman, older than she looked, placed her hand on his shoulder and said nothing, but her tears began to fall. Later, she told Mary, "He's not here to learn what we know. He's here to remember what we've forgotten." In Egypt, memory wasn't taught, it was triggered. For the child, learning did not follow language. He absorbed more through presence than instruction. Certain stones would cause him to stop and stare for minutes. Some rooms made him speak in phrases that surprised even him. Occasionally, he would enter moments of silence so deep, his breath would slow to a near stillness. These weren't performances, they were inner recognitions. The remnants of the ancient temples, though damaged, still held energetic codes, frequencies embedded into their architecture, aligned to star systems and Earth's magnetic field. The boy's subtle body responded to these structures the way a tuning fork responds to sound. It wasn't about history. It was about resonance. Elders around him noticed. They didn't try to interfere. Instead, they observed how the energy moved around him, how animals grew calm in his presence, how water would ripple when he placed his hand near it. These weren't miracles. They were effects, evidence that his nervous system was already operating at a frequency most took lifetimes to reach. Mary and Joseph protected this environment fiercely. They shielded him from crowds, from unnecessary speech, from overstimulation. But they didn't isolate him. They let him move through the world softly, a boy among others barefoot in courtyards, laughing at birds. Nothing about him drew attention, except to those who could feel the field beneath the form. He was not aware of who he would become, but he was beginning to sense that he was different. At night, he often woke without fear, eyes wide open, as if listening to something not present in the room. Once, Mary asked him what he was hearing. He said, "It's not hearing, it's remembering." There were no visions of glory, no prophetic declarations, only a gradual thinning of the veil. The child was not being trained by others. He was being met by the earth itself, by the memory in its stones, the intelligence in its geometry, and the breath of its old temples that still knew how to speak to a soul. By the time he left Egypt, something in him had shifted. He didn't speak of it, but from then on, when he touched the wall, he listened for what was underneath. And more often than not, he heard something answer. His time in Egypt had awakened something. Not memory in the way we understand it, but recognition of energy, of frequency, of truth unspoken. But Egypt had given what it could. The temples had fractured, and the deeper teachings had long gone underground. The next phase of his path required movement. And so, in his later youth, Jesus traveled east, not in a royal caravan, not as a mystic on display, but as a quiet student among strangers, seeking, listening, blending into silence. India was unlike anything he had known. Here, spiritual practice was not hidden. It was life. Sacred texts were recited aloud in the streets. Ascetics sat motionless beneath trees. Breath and body were tools of awakening, not shame. And instead of worshiping a single god, the people engaged with divinity through many forms: light, sound, movement, emptiness. At first, he said little. He had questions, but knew better than to speak them. He observed. He mimicked breathing patterns. He practiced walking slowly, speaking less, eating with awareness. It wasn't religion he was learning. It was refinement. He was received by certain teachers, not because he claimed anything, but because they saw something in his eyes. They did not ask his name. They asked what he noticed when he closed his eyes. They asked what sound remained after all sound stopped. These weren't tests. They were invitations, and he accepted. Through disciplined breathwork, he discovered how to still the body until the mind became transparent. Through mantra, he learned how vibration could reshape the nervous system. Through long periods of silence, he began to sense the architecture of thought itself, the scaffolding that holds illusion in place. But it was not instant. There were days of frustration, moments of resistance. His body would ache from sitting too long. His breath would turn shallow. His mind, once clear, would fill with noise. But he stayed. And slowly, the current returned, not as vision, but as stillness. India was not about revelation. It was about capacity. He wasn't collecting knowledge. He was learning how to hold more light without collapsing. As months turned to years, something within him began to organize. Not intellectually, but energetically. Layers of tension he didn't know he carried began to dissolve. Old impressions, some personal, some ancient, rose to the surface during meditation, only to fall away without attachment. It was here that he learned the true meaning of purification. Not denial, not discipline, but release. He met teachers who spoke no words. Their instruction was presence. Some sat in caves for years, unmoving. Others spoke in riddles. But all carried the same understanding. The soul is not bound by the body. It is remembered through it. They didn't tell him who he was. They gave him space to find out. It was also here that he encountered telepathic communion for the first time, not as vision, but as a shared silence that carried meaning. In the mountains, far from cities, he sat with a man who never opened his eyes. They did not speak for days. But on the seventh day, the man nodded once, and Jesus felt as if entire libraries had been transferred into his bones. This was not magic. It was resonance between fields. India taught him that awareness was not an idea. It was a vibration. And that to embody truth was not to speak it, but to live in such stillness that the world around you reorganizes in your presence. He also came to understand karma in a new way. Not as judgment, but as inertia, unresolved energy still in motion. He saw that lineage trauma could be cleared through the body, that compassion could dissolve entire timelines, and that suffering was not punishment, but compression, the soul pressing against illusion, seeking space to expand. And slowly, through practice, he began to feel it. Not memory, not identity, but an intelligence beyond thought moving through him, gently at first, then more clearly. A kind of knowing that didn't speak in words, but in directions. He began to trust what he couldn't explain. He began to follow silence like a compass. He wasn't becoming divine. He was becoming empty enough to let the divine move. By the time he left India, something fundamental had changed. He no longer sought answers. He moved through space the way breath moves through the body, without needing to be seen, only felt. He left as quietly as he came. No one called him teacher, but everyone who met him felt just a little more awake when he walked away. He returned different, not elevated, not exalted, just still. More breath than personality, more presence than performance. Those who greeted him at Qumran felt it immediately. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer praise. They opened the gates and let silence carry the weight of recognition. This was not a reunion of emotion. It was a recalibration of purpose. The Essenes were unlike any other group on earth. While many believed in spiritual practice, few embodied it so completely. They lived apart from society, not out of superiority, but necessity. The world outside moved in chaos. The world within their walls moved by rhythm, cycles, and codes of light. Their days were structured, but never rigid. Every act, washing, eating, resting, was considered sacred. Every breath was accounted for. Their lives weren't ascetic for the sake of denial. They were refined, precise, intentional. The Essenes understood vibration, and everything they did was designed to maintain coherence. This was the environment Jesus re-entered, not as a boy, not as a guest, but as one of their own. His initiation didn't begin with teachings. It began with stillness. For days, he remained alone in a small stone chamber, without food, without speech, with only water and breath. This wasn't a test of endurance. It was a clearing, allowing the field to settle, the mind to empty, and the resonance of the outer world to dissolve from his system. When he emerged, he spoke 3 words: "I am ready." The elders didn't smile. They didn't nod. They simply led him forward. Initiation among the Essenes wasn't symbolic. It was energetic. To be initiated meant to be aligned, internally, vibrationally, with the intelligence that moves through all things. Each stage required the body to attune more deeply to light, to release density, to hold frequencies once only accessed through vision or dream. He was not given scripture. He was given tasks. For 7 nights, he walked blindfolded beneath the stars. For 7 days, He fasted in complete silence while others recited tones around him. For weeks, he observed the movements of animals, wind, and shadow until he could sense rhythm beneath randomness. They weren't teaching him to believe. They were teaching him to perceive. As his training continued, the focus narrowed. Not on knowledge, but on density. The Essenes knew that true power wasn't in what you could recite, but in what your field could carry without distortion. Their goal wasn't to fill him with wisdom. It was to make his vessel so still, so clear, that higher intelligence could move through him without resistance. He was taught to fast, not as punishment, but as frequency modulation. He learned to walk at night in total darkness, not for survival, but to develop inner orientation. He spent days in water, silent and still, not to purify the body, but to dissolve the ego's boundaries. Every practice was a language, nonverbal, cellular, symbolic. He began to hear things differently. A bird's cry became a tone. A breeze became a message. Light itself began to carry layered meaning. The elders said little. Their guidance came through presence. They would sit near him in long silence, and when the moment felt right, one would place a hand on the earth and simply say, "Listen," not to the sound, but to what was underneath it. Over time, he could feel shifts in the land, detect discord in a person's field, and perceive the emotional residue left in a room long after others had left. These were not supernatural gifts. They were natural abilities restored through discipline. The final phase of initiation was the merging. Not with a group, not with a title, but with the Oversoul itself, the larger aspect of his being that had always remained outside time. The Essenes called this the Great Return. It wasn't dramatic. There were no visions or celestial voices. Just a deep, unmistakable knowing that the personality was no longer the pilot. From that point forward, he walked differently. Not slower, but quieter. Not lighter, but deeper. People near him felt it immediately, even if they didn't understand it. Animals would follow him without fear. Children would look into his eyes and fall silent. Elders would pause mid-sentence and forget what they were saying. He didn't tell them who he was. He didn't need to. The Essenes never declared his initiation complete. There was no ceremony, no proclamation. Only one moment when an elder stood beside him at sunrise and said, "The wind no longer passes through you. You have become the wind." The initiations were complete, but the questions remained. Even with all he had remembered, even with the stillness he carried, he was still human. The silence taught him to hear. The fasting cleared his vision. The Essenes helped him awaken. But awakening did not mean immunity. Inside him, two realities coexisted: the vast awareness of the Oversoul and the fragile sensitivity of the man who had to carry it. And the weight was real. He could feel people's pain before they spoke. He could sense grief that had no words. He would enter a village and know, without being told, who was dying, who was hiding sorrow, who no longer believed in anything. It was not mystical. It was exhausting. There were nights he would return to solitude and sit motionless for hours, not meditating, but emptying. Not seeking light, but trying to release the residue of what he had absorbed from others. He didn't speak of this. There was no one who would fully understand. To the world, he would become a figure of strength. But within himself, he wrestled with a truth few ever saw: that compassion hurts. Not because it is weakness, but because it requires openness in a world that wounds. He also struggled with the role he had agreed to. There were moments when the path ahead felt impossibly heavy, when the magnitude of what was being asked felt unfair, even cruel. He had glimpsed the outcome, how people would misinterpret his words, twist his teachings, build structures in his name that would deny the very essence of what he came to remind them of. And still, he was asked to walk forward. He doubted not the truth, but the form it would have to take. There were days he wanted only to live quietly, to stay among the Essenes, to teach small groups, to be a healer, a traveler, a silent servant. But the call would not fade. It didn't shout. It pressed, gently, constantly, until resistance became more painful than surrender. He had been trained to carry light, but nothing had prepared him for how dark the world could feel. He knew he couldn't carry the weight alone. So he returned often to solitude, not to escape others, but to return to center. He walked into the hills at dawn, found still places by rivers, and lay on stone just to feel the earth again. These were not rituals. They were survival. Without stillness, the noise of the world threatened to pull him under. In these moments, he didn't pray for strength. He listened. And what came was not answers, but presence. There were no visions, no voices from heaven, only a subtle pressure, like the weight of a hand on the chest, reminding him, "You chose this. You are not alone." It didn't remove the pain, but it made space for it. And he began to understand something essential. That holding light doesn't mean avoiding darkness. It means becoming spacious enough to contain both. He stopped resisting the ache. He let himself feel it fully: loss, fatigue, the sharp longing to go home to somewhere beyond this world. He realized even this pain was part of the preparation. It opened him. It made him transparent. It stripped away any illusion that the mission could be fulfilled through power, charisma, or certainty. What remained was presence. Pure, quiet, unwavering presence. In that space, he became more human, fully human. Not the untouchable figure history would later sculpt, but a man who felt deeply and chose love anyway. He didn't wait for fear to disappear before stepping forward. He brought it with him, gently, truthfully, until it had no more ground to stand on. This is what made his message real. Not the miracles, not the sermons, but that behind every word he spoke was a heart that had broken open and stayed open. The Essenes saw this change. They didn't name it, they didn't record it, but they knew he was no longer in training. He had entered the mystery itself, not as an idea, but as embodiment. By the time the world saw him, he had already been seen, not by crowds or priests or kings, but by those who never wore bodies. The guides who had watched since before his birth began to draw nearer, not as visions, not as commands, but as presence, subtle, quiet, unmistakable. These beings didn't appear in fire or light. They came through vibration, a shift in the air, a stillness that pressed on the edges of thought, a clarity that emerged without process or logic. They never gave him answers. They asked questions, wordlessly. Are you grounded enough to act without approval? Can you speak truth in a place that fears it? Will you walk forward even when your name is erased from your own message? They didn't test him. They reminded him. Because these weren't angels in the traditional sense. They were intelligences, consciousnesses outside time, many of whom had walked Earth before and transcended it. Some had incarnated in Atlantis, others in Egypt. Some had never entered form, but held the blueprint of humanity's unfolding in their field. To them, Jesus was not exceptional. He was willing to carry the signal through density, willing to remember what others had forgotten, willing to stay when every part of him longed to go home. They guided him not through visions, but through subtle alignment. If he veered even slightly from resonance, he would feel an immediate inner dissonance, a kind of spiritual gravity pulling him back into coherence. He learned to trust that pull, not as correction, but as recalibration. At times, they would direct him to places, quiet hills, sacred groves, stone circles forgotten by history. He never knew why until he arrived. And then the energy would open, soft, ancient, familiar. The veil would lift, not outwardly, but within. And there, guidance would come. Not in language, but in knowing. He never spoke of these beings, not because he was told not to, but because words would shrink what could only be felt. He learned early that sacred things dissolve when exposed to those who haven't cultivated the stillness to receive them. So he guarded the contact, not with secrecy, but with simplicity. He never claimed to channel. He never used titles. He simply listened. Their presence brought no commands, only clarity, and that clarity became his compass. In moments of uncertainty, he wouldn't ask, "What should I do?" He would feel inward, into the quiet thread of alignment, and notice where the resistance softened. That was the direction. That was the teaching. It was never about outcomes. It was about being tuned, moment to moment. These guides weren't separate from him. They were extensions of the same intelligence he was learning to embody. Like fingers on the same hand, different functions, one source. Sometimes their presence came as light. Not visible, but felt, like warmth behind the eyes, like breath expanding without air. Other times, it came as timing. A person would appear with the exact word he needed. A bird would fly across his path at the moment a question rose. Rain would begin just as his thoughts reached confusion. These weren't coincidences. They were answers delivered through the language of life itself. He began to see that guidance was everywhere. That the veil wasn't something to pierce. It was something to soften into. The more he emptied, the more space these beings had to move through him. Not to possess or direct, but to amplify the frequency he was already becoming. Why the Essenes trained in silence. Why India taught him breath and stillness. Why Egypt whispered instead of shouted. It had all been preparation, not to hear more voices, but to hear the one voice underneath all things. And now, as his body stood rooted on earth, his awareness began to stretch beyond it. He could feel the grid lines of energy connecting sacred places. He could sense others like him, waking in different lands, preparing in their own way. He could see that what he was part of was not isolated. It was coordinated, global, interdimensional, and soon he would step out of the silence and begin to speak. There was no announcement, no angelic fanfare, no clear sign that the time had come. The shift was internal, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed had he not been trained to feel the smallest changes in the field. It was a stillness deeper than silence, not the absence of motion, but the presence of readiness. He had stopped seeking. There was nothing more to accumulate, only to embody. The final years of preparation had brought him to a state where thought no longer initiated action, alignment did. He no longer needed to analyze, plan, or interpret. He responded to the current as it moved through him, the way a tree bends with the wind, not with effort, but with presence. And then the instruction came, not from outside, but from within. Go to the river. It wasn't a voice. It was a pulse, a wave in his chest, the kind of knowing that cannot be reasoned with. He walked for days without question, stopping only when the feeling faded. It would return again at dawn, guiding his next steps. It led him through dry hills and quiet villages until he reached the place, familiar, though he'd never stood there before. John was already in the water, the one who had also trained in silence, who had also fasted, emptied, and cleared his name of attachment. The one who knew something was coming, though he wasn't sure what. They didn't speak at first. The wind moved across the surface of the Jordan, and in that moment, both men understood. It was time. This act, the baptism, would become myth. But what happened beneath the surface was not about water. It was about resonance, about transmission, about one soul recognizing another and stepping into a shared current that had been flowing long before either of them were born. As Jean placed his hands upon him, something subtle but irreversible occurred. Not a light descending, not a crown forming, but emerging. The Oversoul, which had hovered at the edge of embodiment for years, finally entered fully, not partially, not symbolically, completely. And for the first time, the full frequency of the Christ moved through human form, not as theory, but as embodiment. When he emerged from the river, the world hadn't changed. But he had, and that was enough. Something irreversible had taken place. The Oversoul was no longer beside him. It was him. This didn't mean he lost his humanity. It meant his humanity was now transparent, an open channel for something greater to move through. From that moment forward, he no longer acted from identity, not even from purpose. He moved from alignment alone. Some call this enlightenment. Others call it embodiment. But the Essenes had another word for it: presence made flesh. He didn't rush. He didn't announce himself. He returned to quiet places, letting the frequency settle into the nervous system, letting the body adapt to holding what most can only touch in fleeting glimpses. And then, slowly, he began to move outward. He didn't seek followers. He didn't declare his name. He simply showed up, fully. And that was enough. People felt it before they understood it. They would stop speaking mid-sentence. They would weep without knowing why. Some would leave confused, unable to remain in the field of his clarity. Others would stay for hours, even in silence, feeling something inside them begin to thaw. He didn't give them something new. He reminded them of something ancient. His words weren't lectures. They were keys, not to explain, but to unlock. The miracles that followed weren't proofs. They were consequences, vibrational results of walking in full coherence with Source. But even as his presence expanded outward, he never saw himself as above anyone. He often said, "I am the door, not the destination, not the exception." A door swings both ways. It opens, it invites. It reminds you that what is on one side of it is also waiting on the other. By stepping into alignment, he created a resonance strong enough for others to remember what they had always carried. Not a religion, not a hierarchy, but a living map drawn not in words, but in frequency. The preparation was complete. The path had begun. He was never meant to be worshipped. He was meant to be remembered, not as a figure in history, but as a reflection of something that still lives in you. His life was a path, a sequence of preparation, purification, and embodiment. And that path was not designed for one man. It was designed for anyone willing to listen inward. You don't need to escape the world to find it. You don't need temples or titles. You only need stillness, honesty, and the willingness to follow the quiet pull of your own soul. Like him, you were born forgetting. Like him, you are surrounded by signs. And like him, the deeper part of you is waiting not to be taught, but to be uncovered. The Christ wasn't a name. It was a state of resonance, and it still moves. Through moments of compassion, through the choice to love in the face of pain, through the courage to show up fully without needing to be seen. He walked that path first, not to lead, but to leave the door open behind him. Now you stand at that door, not because you're unworthy, but because you are ready. So take a breath. Feel what stirs beneath the noise. And remember, the silence that shaped him is shaping you too.